Hey everyone, welcome back to Karenology. This story will have you shaking your head in disbelief. The first time I heard the barking, I thought it was just a neighbor's dog left outside too long. The second time, I realized it was coming from a speaker. By the third night, I knew this was war. I had lived in this neighborhood my entire life. My parents bought this house when I was a kid, and after they passed, I stayed. I liked the quiet. That was the whole point of living in a small suburban town. Peace, routine, and the certainty that nothing ever changed too much. That was until Bob moved in. Bob arrived a month ago, dragging his oversized trailer and his even larger ego with him. He was in his early 50s, a thick-set man with a shaved head, permanently wearing cargo shorts no matter the weather. He had the swagger of someone who expected respect before earning it. The kind of guy who assumed that just because he was the loudest voice in the room, people would listen. The first time we met, he told me, not asked, that he would be setting up a security system, just in case, because, according to him, these kinds of places get weird at night. These kinds of places, as if he wasn't the newcomer here. I ignored him at first. People move in, they settle, they adjust. But Bob wasn't adjusting. He was imposing. Then the speaker appeared. At first, it was only on for short bursts during the day. A few minutes of barking, then silence. It was weird, but not unbearable. I assumed he had some kind of motion sensor system, or was testing out a deterrent for wild animals. But as the days passed, the barking grew longer. Then it continued into the evening. And by the end of the week, it was on all night, echoing through the street, bouncing off houses, clawing into my skull. I walked over the next morning. Bob was outside, sitting in a cheap plastic chair in his driveway, sipping coffee like he hadn't just tortured the entire street for hours. I kept it polite. "Hey Bob, I think something's up with your speaker. It was going all night." He looked at me over the rim of his mug and smirked. "Yeah, helps me sleep." I blinked. "What?" "The noise," he said. "Can't sleep without it. Grew up in a rough part of town, always had dogs barking. This helps me feel at home." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. "Well, it's really loud and constant. Maybe you could turn it down at night?" Bob shrugged. "It's my property." I felt my jaw tighten. "Yeah, but it's keeping the whole neighborhood awake." "You got proof of that?" His smirk widened. "You the spokesperson for the whole block now?" I forced a breath through my nose. "I don't think we need proof. It's obvious." Bob took another sip of coffee, then leaned forward slightly. "Well, if it's so obvious, why don't you call the cops?" I should have. But I made a mistake. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Instead, I tried to talk to the other neighbors. Most of them were elderly, and while they admitted the noise was awful, none of them wanted trouble. One even suggested that Bob might just be adjusting, and that it would pass. The only person on my side was Rachel, a single mother down the street. She said the barking was making her son anxious. "I have to play white noise just to get him to sleep," she admitted. "But what can we do?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. That night I tried to sleep through it. The barking wasn't just loud. It was designed to be aggravating. A deep, echoing sound that cut through walls, rising and falling in a way that made relaxation impossible. I put in earplugs. They didn't help. I tried white noise. Useless. The sound crawled under my skin, turning my bedroom into a prison of noise. At 3 a.m., I snapped. I stormed outside, marched to Bob's driveway, and pounded on his door. The barking continued, relentless. After a long pause, the door creaked open. Bob stood there in his boxers, looking thoroughly unimpressed. "Yeah?" I didn't bother hiding my frustration. "Turn it off." He scratched his belly, feigning confusion. "What?" "The damn speaker, Bob." He yawned. "Oh, yeah, no, that's not happening." I clenched my fists. "You can't just—" "Sure I can," he interrupted, grinning. Noise ordinances say nothing about recorded dog barking. As long as it's under the decibel limit, I'm golden. I didn't know if that was true, but I knew one thing. This wasn't going to stop on its own. And if Bob wanted a fight, I was ready to give him one. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had been run over by a truck. The barking had continued all night, drilling into my skull with relentless precision. I had barely managed a few hours of broken sleep, and my body ached from the tension of lying awake, fists clenched, waiting for it to stop. But it never did. This was Bob's message to me. He wasn't backing down. I stumbled to the kitchen, brewed the strongest coffee I could, and sat at the table, my mind clouded with exhaustion. I needed a plan. Complaining wasn't going to work. I needed leverage. I grabbed my laptop and started looking up city regulations. If Bob was right about noise ordinances, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I combed through every piece of legislation I could find. There were restrictions on loud music, car alarms, and construction work, but nothing specific about pre-recorded dog barking. That couldn't be right. I dug deeper, finding cases of noise complaints that had led to fines, injunctions, even forced evictions. It all came down to interpretation and persistence. I could work with that. Before I could do anything official, I needed evidence. That night, I set up a recording device on my porch. If I could capture how unbearable the noise was, maybe I could use it against him. The barking began like clockwork. The same mechanical cycle of yelps and growls, artificial but relentless. I sat awake, listening. Every muscle in my body coiled tight. It was psychological warfare. Rachel knocked on my door around noon, dark circles under her eyes. Her son had barely slept either. She had tried talking to Bob that morning, only to be met with the same smirk and dismissive attitude. "He told me to buy earplugs," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. "I can't live like this, James. None of us can." I assured her I had a plan. The problem was, it wasn't much of one. Complaints alone wouldn't be enough. I needed something that would force the city to act. That night, I sat on my porch, watching Bob's house. The barking blared from the speaker, a relentless, artificial nightmare. Around 3 a.m. I heard something new. A pause, then a muffled thud, like someone moving equipment. I peeked through my blinds. Bob was outside, adjusting the speaker. He glanced around, then smirked up at my house before cranking the volume even higher. I saw red. I grabbed my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. A bored-sounding dispatcher answered. "I'd like to report a noise complaint," I said, keeping my voice calm. "My neighbor has been blasting recorded dog barking all night for days. It's unbearable." "What's the address?" I gave it to her. "Has anyone spoken to him?" she asked. "Yes, multiple times. He refuses to stop." She sighed. "We'll send someone out when we can." I knew what that meant. Maybe they'd drive by. Maybe they wouldn't. But I wasn't waiting around. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, walking straight toward Bob's house. His porch light flicked on before I even reached the driveway. He was waiting. "That didn't take long," he called, leaning against the door frame. "Let me guess. Cops didn't care." I kept my voice steady. "This has to stop." He grinned. "I don't think so." I took another step. "I have a recording. Hours of it. I can file an official complaint, get the city involved." Bob's grin widened. "Go ahead. Like I said, noise ordinances don't cover pre-recorded barking." I checked. "And if you try anything else, that's harassment." He gestured toward a small camera mounted above his door. "I protect myself. You should too." I stared at him, rage bubbling under my skin. He had thought of everything, but he had also underestimated me. I turned without another word and walked home. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next day, I started gathering signatures from the neighbors. Many were hesitant. They didn't want trouble, didn't want to get involved. Bob's the kind of guy who holds grudges, one older woman told me. I don't want him targeting me next. I understood their fear, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. Rachel signed immediately, then a few others. It was a slow process, but by the end of the day, I had enough names to show the city that this was more than just one person complaining. I also decided to take things a step further. If the city wouldn't act quickly, maybe public pressure would. I reached out to a local news station, submitting an anonymous tip about a man tormenting an entire neighborhood with artificial dog barking. It wasn't long before I got a response. A reporter was interested. If I could provide video proof, they'd run a story. That night, I set up a second camera, one that wouldn't just capture the noise, but Bob himself, smirking as he tormented us. He thought he was untouchable. I was about to prove him wrong. By the time the third night of no sleep rolled around, I was beyond exhausted. My patience had been stretched to the breaking point, my nerves frayed by the endless artificial barking. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a weapon, slicing through my sanity, invading every quiet moment. Bob had made it clear. This wasn't about noise, it was about control, and I wasn't going to let him win. I had my recordings. I had my complaint filed with the city. I had a petition gathering momentum among the neighbors. But Bob wasn't letting up, and the police still weren't taking it seriously. If I wanted results, I needed to push harder. Rachel called me that afternoon. She sounded shaken. "He confronted me today," she said. "He knows we're trying to get the city involved." I gripped the phone tighter. "What did he say?" He laughed. Said he's been through this before and that no one can force him to stop. Then he told me that if I keep making trouble, I might regret it. My stomach twisted. "He threatened you?" A pause. "Not directly, but the way he said it. I don't feel safe." I took a slow breath, trying to steady my anger. "You're not alone in this. We're not backing down." That night, I didn't just set up my recording equipment. I made sure my second camera had a perfect view of Bob's house. If he was going to keep this up, I wanted proof of more than just the noise. The barking started at the usual time. This time it was louder. Somehow, impossibly, Bob had managed to increase the volume. The walls vibrated with the sound, my windows rattling from the force of it. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stepped outside. I wasn't going to wait. I was done waiting. I marched straight to Bob's driveway. He was sitting in his lawn chair, feet up on a cooler, beer in hand. He saw me coming and smirked. "Evening, neighbor." "Turn it off, Bob." He took a sip of his beer. "Not in the mood for company? I'm done playing games. Either you turn it off, or I take this further." He raised an eyebrow. "Further than what? Your little petition? Your noise complaints?" He shook his head, chuckling. "I told you, James. I checked the laws. I'm not breaking anything." I stepped closer. "You're harassing an entire neighborhood." He waved a hand. "Just background noise. You city folks are too soft." "This isn't a joke, Bob." His smirk faltered just a little. "You're gonna make me, huh?" I held his gaze. "You don't want to find out." He let out a short laugh. "You recording this? Hoping I'll slip up? Fine. You want a show? I'll give you a show." Bob stood up and walked to the speaker. I thought, for one hopeful second, that he was going to turn it off. Instead, he adjusted something, and the barking intensified, becoming an unbearable wall of sound. My ears rang. My teeth clenched. I turned and walked away. Not because I was giving up, because I had everything I needed. The next morning, I sent the footage to the city and the news station. The petition had reached over 100 signatures. More neighbors were stepping forward. The pressure was building. Then, just when I thought Bob couldn't escalate further, he did. A pounding at my door jolted me awake. I opened it to find Rachel standing there, pale and shaking. "He put up cameras," she whispered, "all over his house, pointed right at us." I stepped outside, my gut twisting. Sure enough, there they were. Multiple security cameras, all angled toward my house, Rachel's, and a few other homes on the block. Bob stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching me with that damn smirk. He gave me a slow, mocking wave. It wasn't just about noise anymore. It was surveillance. It was intimidation. He was pushing, daring me to make a mistake. The barking hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. More people were complaining now, but Bob wasn't backing down. He had doubled down, as if feeding off the frustration and fear he was creating. That night, I saw movement in my backyard. I grabbed a flashlight and peered through the blinds, heart hammering. A shadow moved by the fence, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I barely slept, running every possible scenario in my mind. If Bob was bold enough to install cameras pointed at our houses, what was next? Would he try to provoke me further? Would he push harder until I finally snapped? The next morning, I saw a police car parked near my house. For a split second, I felt hope. Maybe someone had finally taken action. But as I stepped outside, the officer was walking away, from Bob's house. Bob called out to me, his voice thick with amusement. "Nice try, James. You think you can win this?" I clenched my fists. "This isn't over." He chuckled. "Oh, I know. That's what makes it fun." I watched as the officer got into his car and drove away. My stomach sank. If the police weren't going to help, I needed another plan. Bob was getting bolder, and I needed to be smarter. I wasn't just fighting against noise anymore. I was fighting against a man who thrived on conflict. And I had no choice but to fight back. The fourth night without sleep felt like a slow descent into madness. The barking wasn't just sound anymore. It had become a force pressing down on me, rattling my brain, turning every thought into static. My house no longer felt like a home. It was a prison, a cage where the walls vibrated with endless, synthetic yelps. I had fought back, but Bob had escalated. Now it was my turn. I needed more than recordings and complaints. The police had already proven useless, and my petition, while growing, wasn't getting immediate results. Bob had cameras now. He had made it clear he was watching. He wanted me to know he wasn't scared. But that worked both ways. If he wanted to play this game, I was going to play it better. I started with the legal angle. I spent hours combing through city ordinances, trying to find anything Bob had overlooked. There had to be something, some loophole he hadn't covered. Then I found it. A clause buried deep in a municipal code about continuous and artificial sound disturbances. It wasn't specific to dogs, but it was enough. If I could prove that the noise was disrupting the well-being of the community, I could push for an immediate injunction. But proof alone wouldn't be enough. I needed influence. The next morning, I reached out to a local journalist. The same reporter who had been interested before now had more than just a noise complaint to work with. I fed her everything. The videos, the police reports, the growing community outrage. I told her about Bob's cameras, his threats, the way he was turning the entire neighborhood into his personal battleground. She was interested. Very interested. By noon, the story was live. Suburban Nightmare, When Noise Becomes a Weapon. The article detailed everything. How a quiet neighborhood had been plunged into chaos by one man's obsession with control. It included clips of the relentless barking, interviews with exhausted neighbors, even a statement from Rachel about how her son's anxiety had worsened because of the constant noise. It painted Bob as a bully, a man exploiting legal loopholes to make life miserable for everyone around him. By the time I went outside that evening, I could feel the shift. Other neighbors were standing in their yards, whispering, watching. Bob's smirk was gone. He had read the article. He had seen the attention it was getting. But instead of backing down, he did what I feared most. He doubled down. That night, the barking wasn't just louder. It was different. Bob had changed the sound file. Now, mixed in with the yelps, were deep, guttural growls. the kind of sounds meant to unnerve, to create a primal sense of unease. It worked. Every time the noise shifted, my pulse spiked. I could feel the fear settling in, the adrenaline coursing through me like poison. I wasn't the only one. Rachel texted me around midnight. "He's playing something else now. It sounds wrong. My son is terrified." I responded immediately. "Stay inside, lock your doors." At 2 a.m., I heard a crash, a loud shattering sound from the side of my house. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my heart pounding. My fence, one of the panels had been kicked in. My pulse roared in my ears as I scanned the darkness. Then I saw it. Mounted on the broken panel, tangled in the wreckage, was a new speaker. It was smaller, but angled perfectly toward my bedroom window. I backed away, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't about noise anymore. This was a message. I called the police. Again. This time they actually showed up. The officers took notes, asked a few questions, then knocked on Bob's door. He answered with the same smug expression, arms crossed over his chest. He played the part perfectly. Calm, reasonable, just a man being harassed by his neighbors. I watched as he spoke, gesturing toward my house, his voice carrying just enough faux concern to make it sound like I was the problem. The officers left without doing anything. I stood in my yard, fists clenched, watching them drive away. Bob turned back toward his house, paused, and then, right there, in the glow of his porch light, he winked at me. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let him win. The next day, I took action. If the police wouldn't help, if legal channels were slow, I would make sure Bob had no safe space left. I compiled every single piece of footage, every disturbing sound clip, and I blasted it across every social media platform I could. The article had already gained traction, but now I was fueling it with real-time updates. I tagged local news stations, city officials, even legal advocates. I made it clear. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. This was a case of harassment, of psychological warfare. And it worked. By the next morning, the city council had issued a statement. They were reviewing the complaint and considering action. The mayor's office had been contacted. Even a few law firms had reached out, interested in a potential case. Bob had spent weeks making me feel powerless, but now, for the first time, I could see cracks forming in his armor. Then something unexpected happened. That evening, as the barking started up again, there was another sound. Something sharp, something violent. A loud crack followed by silence. The barking cut off mid-loop. Confused, I ran outside. Bob's main speaker had been destroyed. Someone had smashed it. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Bob stormed outside moments later, eyes wild, face red with rage. He scanned the street, fists clenched. He knew it wasn't me. I had been too public, too careful. But someone, somewhere, had had enough. The war wasn't over, but the tide was turning. The silence after the speaker was destroyed felt unnatural. I had spent weeks hearing nothing but that endless grating bark, but now the absence of sound was just as unsettling. My neighborhood, once again, felt like a battlefield where something had just detonated. I stood in my yard, watching Bob survey the wreckage of his shattered speaker, his face twisting with fury. He turned sharply, scanning the street, looking for a culprit. I stayed in the shadows, watching. He knew it wasn't me. I had made sure to be seen in my house, online, everywhere. I was too public to have done this. And that was the worst part for him. Someone else had acted. The neighborhood was no longer just annoyed. It was fighting back. That night, the silence was heavy. But I barely slept. I expected retaliation. I expected Bob to try something bigger, something worse. He wasn't the type to let this go. He thrived on control, and someone had just taken it from him. At 3 a.m., my instincts proved right. A crash outside jolted me awake. I shot out of bed, heart hammering, grabbing my phone and flashlight. I barely had to step onto my porch to see what had happened. My mailbox was smashed to pieces, its wooden post splintered. My trash cans were overturned, garbage scattered across my lawn. And there, nailed to the remains of the mailbox, was a note scribbled in thick red marker. "You think this is over?" I clenched my jaw, my hands shaking. This wasn't a message, this was a challenge. Bob was telling me he wasn't done, that he was still in control. He was daring me to respond, to escalate further. I refused to take the bait. Instead, I took pictures, documented everything, and posted it online. Within an hour, neighbors were commenting, sharing similar experiences. Someone's garden had been trampled. Another neighbor found deep scratches along the side of their car. A few people admitted they had heard something outside, but were too afraid to check. Bob wasn't just targeting me now. He was lashing out at everyone. The next morning, the news crews arrived. The story had spread, and local reporters were eager to cover the growing conflict. Cameras rolled as I explained what had been happening, showing them the damage, the threats, the fear Bob had instilled in the entire block. Bob watched from his porch, arms crossed, his face expressionless. But there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not smug satisfaction, uncertainty. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself. He had controlled the situation for so long, but now it was slipping away from him. Then the police arrived. But this time, they weren't just there to take notes. They were there to investigate. Bob tried to play his usual act, calm, reasonable, just a concerned citizen being unfairly harassed. But the police weren't buying it this time. The media coverage had done its job. Public pressure was mounting, and the department couldn't ignore it anymore. They questioned him, examined the footage, and, for the first time, took statements from multiple neighbors, instead of just dismissing the complaints. When they left, Bob wasn't smirking. He was pacing, thinking, plotting. That night, the barking returned. Not from a speaker, not from any sound system, from actual dogs. Bob had somehow managed to bring in live animals, station them in his backyard, and let them bark throughout the night. It was a sick, calculated move. He knew that real dogs wouldn't be covered by the same noise complaints. He knew it would take longer for any legal action to be enforced. But he had underestimated just how done the neighborhood was with him. At 2 a.m., I heard it. The sound of multiple car doors slamming. Footsteps. Voices. I looked out my window and saw something I never expected. My neighbors, dozens of them, gathering in front of Bob's house. They were tired. They were angry. And they weren't backing down anymore. Someone knocked on my door. Rachel. "Come on," she said. "We're ending this." I joined them. We stood in Bob's front yard, not shouting, not making threats, just standing, watching, holding our ground. Bob came outside trying to look unbothered, but I could see it now, the panic beneath the surface. "You all need to get off my property," he growled. "This is illegal." One of the older neighbors, a man who had lived here even longer than me, stepped forward. "We're not leaving, Bob. We're done being scared of you." Bob's hands clenched into fists. He looked around, as if waiting for someone to step in, for the police to arrive and break up the crowd. But no one moved. No one spoke. We just waited. And Bob, finally, truly, had no idea what to do. The next morning, the city made its move. Fines, violations, a legal notice about the cameras, the noise, the harassment. Bob fought it, of course, but the damage was done. He wasn't untouchable anymore. And over the next few weeks, as the pressure mounted, as his legal troubles grew, something happened that I never expected. A for sale sign appeared in Bob's yard. It was over. I stood at my window the day the moving trucks arrived, watching as he packed up his life and drove away. No goodbyes, no final threats, just silence. The first real silence I had heard in months. That night, I slept better than I had in years.